Why is it that some people are very easy to talk to, whereas others are extremely awkward or closed off, and it just makes the conversation very difficult? Well, this, you might be surprised to know that it has less to do with an individual's character or their personality and more to do with an invisible cultural norm. This is something that we refer to commonly as direct and indirect communication. And today I'm going to teach you how to identify this in the workplace, how to identify this even in your family or social setting, and how to use each style appropriately. Now, to begin with, if you work in the United States or anywhere where Western culture tends to dominate, for instance, in most of Europe or in Australia, then it's very likely that you lead with a direct style of communication. Direct communication is extremely useful in business. It tends to be very open, very focused on clarity, and very focused on process. And as a result of that, it comes off as very trusting, because at the essence of direct communication is the ability to achieve clear, concise communication with as few words as possible. Now, if you tend to work in a non-Western environment, for instance, most of Latin America or in parts of Asia, then it's more likely than not that you're leading with a style of communication that is considered indirect. Now, contrary to direct communication, indirect communication is very nuanced. It relies on similes or idioms. It doesn't always mean, the words that you use don't exactly always mean exactly what you're saying, but rather the message is in between the words or even sometimes in what's not said. So as a result of this, it can be more difficult to identify, especially for people who are more used to the direct style of communication. So let's dive into this together and I'll show you exactly how to spot this. So let's begin with direct communication. As we discussed, the main goal of direct communication is clarity. So because the focus is on clarity, the actual use of the words matters quite a bit. A simple example might be, can I talk to you? So that is a very simple sentence. It's a very simple statement that focuses on a question that I need solved or I need an answer to. And the quickest and most expedient way to get my message across is to simply ask the question, can I talk to you? That is a very simple form of direct communication. Now, as you saw, there's also other factors that are at play here. For instance, efficiency, speed, and we'll talk about compliance later, but for sure the first three were present in that very simple statement. Now, just to put that into perspective, let's contrast that to a similar question, but that would be more angled or styled in an indirect form of communication. The very same statement would be, are you busy right now? So think about this. A, direct, can I ask you a question? It's direct, it's focused, it's unambiguous. Exhibit B, indirect, is, are you busy right now? So in this second statement, I didn't actually come out directly and ask that person if I could ask them a question. Rather, I'm asking if they're busy at the moment. Now, depending on the circumstance, this is going to be a very well phrased way to approach somebody or not. And that's really what this is why this matters, because first of all, you need to identify which is your predominant style, and because it is very cultural in the way that it leans, if you grew up and you work in a predominantly Western environment in the United States or in Canada, then it's very likely that you lead with a direct form of communication. If, however, you were born in Latin America or in an Asian country and you work in those environments primarily, then it's more likely that you're going to lead with this. Really, the concerns or the issues come into place when one person doesn't understand the other, and then there's often this conversation around a language barrier or the timing or the personality of an individual, but very rarely do people stop to think about this idea that's actually operating silently behind the scenes, and everybody's oblivious to it. So let's write those down right now. Can I talk to you? So this is going to be the direct form of asking a question where I might need somebody's input. The indirect form is, are you busy right now? Or we might just sum it up as, are you busy? So right off the bat, I would ask you, which one feels more natural to you? Can I talk to you, or are you busy? And I would argue that if you tend to be more of a direct speaker, then this statement, are you busy, might even come off as irritable. In fact, I would probably bet that even hearing this from me right now, are you busy right now? You might even have like the hairs on the back of your neck stick up because you're like, what does this person want? And at the end of the day, that's because you are more accustomed to a direct form of communication. And as Dr. Deborah Tannen, who is a famous linguist, would suggest, those who tend to lead with a direct form of communication perceive those that lead with an indirect form of communication as potentially dishonest or deceiving or even manipulative. I mean, those are some pretty big words, right? And some pretty harsh accusations. Now, meanwhile, the person who tends to lead with an indirect form of communication may just be trying to not actually bother you or to interfere with your work. And as a result of that, they actually lead with the question, are you busy? Because hypothetically, if you were busy, you would say, yes, I'm actually busy at the moment. And as a result of that, they would say, okay, I'll just come back another time when you have some more time. So right off the bat, you're probably already thinking, this explains a little bit about why I can't seem to get along with some people at work. Now we're going to go into some case studies here in just a moment, but I do want to talk a little bit about indirect. So in indirect communication, the focus tends to be on curiosity. So this question, are you busy, is very appropriate because the person who is asking this question is not accusing, is not making, any, any thoughts of their own, preconceived thoughts. Rather, they are, for the most part, remaining open to influence and to being curious about where you are, what you think, and what you're even doing. That's why this question is so appropriate for this type of communicator. Harmony is ultimately the goal. So if we think about relationship and harmony, people who tend to speak in an indirect manner tend to hold that very close to them. They want to make sure that they're not coming off as pushy or forceful or even arrogant. And as a result, their communication might come off sometimes as meek or, indirect in a way. But that perception or that form of speech can really trigger an individual who is accustomed to a very direct form of communication because, as I mentioned a moment ago, as Deborah Tannen states, they can be perceived as manipulative. And, nobody wants to be manipulated, right? So now what's another thing? Diplomacy. So this is probably the reason why it comes off as untrustworthy, because indirect communication is favored very much by the political elite. Essentially, the form of communication that they use when they conduct interviews or rallies, and it doesn't matter where or which way you lean politically, but politically, it tends to lend itself to this form of speech because it offers the opportunity for diplomacy. So we're going to give an example of that later. But right off the bat, you're probably thinking, oh man, that's just another reason why I don't like this form of communication. And yet it matters so much in how we use it in our everyday affairs, whether it's work or our family. So we'll dive into that here again in a moment. The last two items is relationship and openness. So when we kind of strip away some of these labels that indirect communication has, what we arrive at is the essence of indirect communication really is the intent to offer respect to the other person. And as a result of that, the focus is on curiosity, on remaining open and open to influence and open to the other person's thoughts and ideas, and also on ultimately building a relationship. Now, we'll soon find out that there is a time and a place for this. So just as those who tend to lead in a very direct way, if you tend to be somebody who leads in an indirect way, then it's very important for you to identify this, because there will be moments when, if you ask this type of question, it won't come off very well. It'll actually send the wrong message. So it's critical for you to identify when you need to use this style of speech and when to be a more direct communicator, while understanding that you're going to naturally have a bias one way or the other, which means you have to be very careful how you approach this, because if you're not even aware of the style of communication that you have, then you will more likely than not either just default to one all of the time, or at least the majority of the time, and you will most certainly not, you will miss those opportunities to connect with other individuals or to get things done in a more expedient manner because you're leaning on the wrong style. So I'll come back to this one here in a moment, but if you guys have watched any of my other videos, you know that I like to use icons. I am of the opinion that icons or imagery is easier to understand. So when we think about direct communication, remember it's kind of the Western style, you know, the honest American style of doing business, if you will, just to use an example. And I have a shield. So this is a shield. Or you can think of it like a badge, you know, like a police officer would wear a badge. So think of it that way. Direct tends to focus on clarity, on speed, on efficiency, and it's a shield also because it protects vulnerability. Now, that could be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. So we're going to discuss the basement qualities of direct communication here in a little bit. But the idea of a shield is appropriate because it kind of protects you. It insulates you from other external factors, even misunderstandings, which is good when what you need is efficiency and clarity, but it will remove other aspects of communication that are ultimately fundamental to building trust and long-term relationships. When we look at indirect communication, I have a heart. Yes, I know it's a little cheesy, but at the end of the day, I want to make it super easy to understand. So indirect communication, although for those that tend to lead with direct communication, can be perceived sometimes as manipulative or insincere, keep in mind that at the root of it is genuine care. So people who lead with indirect communication or who just espouse this culturally, more often than not, they actually want to build harmony and a relationship with you. And that's why, to use a simple example, if you think about a culture that is steeped in indirect communication, one that comes to mind is Italy, of course, Mexico. And when you like observe people who speak in that language, whether it's Spanish or Italian, even like think about like the World Cup just took place here a few months ago, and if you saw like some of these European players, they would like put their hands up like this, you know, and the way they talk is like very emotional, very emotionally driven, which you could contrast that with, say, like the Norwegian soccer players who are a lot more stoic and cold, maybe more direct, or like German soccer players, or even the American soccer players. All right, we'll move away from the topic of soccer, but ultimately, this is really about understanding how this shows up in the workplace and how this shows up in your personal life. So with that, we're going to give a few examples, and then we're going to come back here. So yes, the board does rotate, which I think is a really neat feature. I think I rotated it the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so let's begin with direct communication. Are we there yet? So this is the quintessential, you know, kids in the car. Nowadays they all have tablets, so I don't even know what they're complaining about. But like when I was a kid, I had to stare out the window and count sheep or cows or fences. But This question is extremely direct. Are we there yet? It's unambiguous. It doesn't lack clarity. It's very specific. Children learn this at a very young age. They adopt this culture from childbirth. So really the environment that they're steeped in or that they grow up in will immediately begin to influence the way they speak and the words that they use and even how they use them and in what context. I love that dress. I love your jacket. I love those shoes. So any statement that has to do with, say, your own appearance or another person's appearance, or even a presentation. Hey, I loved your video. That was such a great video. It helped me so much. Thank you. Thank you. Those are very direct forms of communication. Now, in my book, I actually used this example. There's a whole chapter that is dedicated to the idea of direct and indirect communication. And the chapter is chapter 6, What's Left Unsaid. And just as a reminder, after every chapter, I have what I define as the playbook. So these are examples for how you can adopt one style or the other in a very practical way. So the idea with this is, you understand the concepts after reading the chapter, but then you have like this chapter summary at the end. And with that, you'll be able to just immediately put these concepts to use. And it's a great way to even evaluate your own ability to learn these different skills. So as I was saying, we're going to talk about basement qualities in full in just a minute, but just because I don't want to forget this, a statement, let's just say that you are with a friend and, there's a bunch of you guys all going out, guys and gals that are all going out. And then, one of your friends shows up in this beautiful dress. And then the moment you look at her, you're like, oh my gosh, I love that dress. And so, naturally this person might say oh, well, thank you. Now let's just say that, let's continue on this example. Let's say that let's just call her Macy. So Macy is wearing a beautiful dress, but then she has a jean jacket on, right? And for whatever reason, you're like, I don't really think that jean jacket looks good. You're thinking this, right? Now, if you're a good direct communicator, you would say, I love that dress, Macy, but I don't really like that jacket. Well, how's Macy gonna feel? So you provided some very accurate information, but it might have come at the expense of hurting her feelings. So she will absolutely love the fact that you mentioned that her dress looks good on her, but the fact that you disliked her jacket will take that entire statement and kind of convert it into a negative experience for Macy. So at the end of the day, the accuracy of the statement, while fulfilling its objective, was insufficient to further your objective, which in all likelihood, your objective, if you're the person making that statement, your objective was to compliment her somehow or to point out something about her, right? Now, in the indirect form of speech, which we'll get to in just a minute, the person wouldn't necessarily lead with a statement that is so bold as, I love that dress. Now, that doesn't mean that, somebody who tends to lean in an indirect form of communication wouldn't pay another person a compliment, but they would probably think it through a little bit more. And the very nature of indirect communication lends itself to ambiguity. So for instance, an example for this might be, oh my gosh, where did you get that dress? So in this case, the example still works. You're still pointing to the dress, but you're no longer focused on a statement around her. Now it's a statement of her. In other words, you as an individual, with your creativity, your mind, your imagination, you went out and identified this dress and you selected it among several different options. So in this case, that really works because you've kind of left room for some opportunity there that wouldn't have been allowed otherwise had you just made that bold statement of, I love that dress, but I don't like the jacket. Don't touch the stove. I think every parent has probably used this form of direct communication before. Let's build on that one a little bit. So aside from the fact that we just told, for instance, a kid not to touch the stove, Why is it that we selected this form of communication and those specific words for that instance? The answer to that is risk, immediacy, directness. So directness works here because it is an alarming situation. Don't touch the stove, get out of the car, run. Any one of these statements that is direct is pointing at a sense of urgency. So when urgency is involved, direct communication works extremely well. Let's use that same example, but with indirect communication. Let's say that, I don't know, his name is Mark. It's a little 5-year-old kid. Mark, I don't think it's a very good idea to touch the stove. Now let's say that there's a pot of boiling water on the stove. In all likelihood, mom and dad would not react the same way, even though they would protect Mark's feelings, right? Because in fact, this happened to me. This happened to me just the other day. We were at an ice cream store with all my kids, and there was this little girl. She was probably, I don't know, just over a year old, barely walking. And she put her fingers in that little crevice where the door swivels. You know, that tiny little crack right between the wall where if you put your fingers and somebody opens the door or closes the door, it'll trap your fingers. I saw this little girl put her fingers in there, and through the window, I saw a couple that was about to come into the restaurant, into the sundae shop. And if they would have opened that door, it would have crushed her little fingers. So I looked down and I immediately grabbed her hand. Now I didn't smack her or anything like that. I simply just grabbed her hand and I said, "No, don't put your hands in there." Now I said it probably a little bit more forcefully, but I wasn't certainly unkind or anything. And she immediately went running over to her mom crying. And I said, "I am so sorry." Her fingers were in the door, and I was just concerned that she would get, and the mom was, of course, she understood everything. It's perfectly fine. Well, that little girl kept mean mugging me for the next 5 minutes. So this is a great example of how, in this instance, what failed, I'm gonna flip this over real quick so we can illustrate the point, but relationship, curiosity, diplomacy, none of that, harmony, none of these things were achieved in this very simple example. None of them. In fact, that little girl, for all I know, thinks I'm probably the worst person on earth by making the statement that I did the way that I did it, right? But what did I achieve? Compliance. So what ended up happening is that little girl thankfully removed her hand right before that couple walked in. Had she not done that, she would have hurt herself and it would have been much, much worse. So this is a great example of how that statement of move your hand or don't put your hand in there and while removing her hand worked very well. Now, let's use a similar example. Let's say that you have 2 kids and one of them snatches another their sibling's iPad away or their phone or whatever. Well, that would be considered very rude and that would not be okay, right? And in that instance, taking somebody's iPad or their phone away or snatching it away from their hands would not be a good idea. So in this example, we need to be very clear on what is the intent, what is the goal, what is the objective, because in either case, we're going to lean into either direct or indirect communication depending on what is needed. So there's no one single way to do this. You have to adapt. You have to adapt to what works. You have to adapt to what is going to be the best way to approach any given situation. Here's another one. We were over here on direct communication. So don't touch the stove versus, hey, I don't think it's a good idea to do that. Can you help me? So this is another great direct form of communication. This is the one that we started the chapter, the lesson with is, can you help me versus are you busy? So good example that we already discussed there. Let's move over to indirect communication and where this would make a lot of sense. For example, there is something about her. In that statement, you kind of leave a lot of unanswered questions. There's something about her. Let's say that you meet somebody new at work and they're telling you about their previous experience, and in that instance, after that you go and speak to another colleague and the person says, hey, what did you think about her? And you answer with, well, there's something about her. So in that moment, what you're basically expressing is many of these things over here. you're talking about curiosity and openness. So you're kind of leaving room for a lot of different things to be expressed. You're not making a decision. You're kind of leaving yourself open to being influenced. And these are, by the way, some really good virtues to have when you're having a conversation with somebody that you met for the very first time. You don't want to, just draw an immediate conclusion unless they're like incredibly creepy or something like that. You probably want to leave that open. So in this case, responding with an indirect form of communication works very well, contrary to maybe saying, well, she's weird, or I didn't like her, or I don't know, I really don't care. So all of those statements might still in some way, reveal something about that encounter that you had with that person, but they would probably be unjustified, especially because you don't really have a lot of context. You don't really know much about her other than that brief interaction, but there's something about her. It's kind of just like leaves that open-ended question. And the most important thing is it allows you to continue to observe, your own understanding of that individual. So you kind of leave that open book, which is a great thing when it comes to, business relationships, personal relationships, friendships, family, you name it. In fact, Soren Kierkegaard, who is a philosopher that I really like, had this quote that says, "Treat people as mysteries, not summaries." And I think that really sums this concept up very, very well. That's one way to put it. So great statement. I really love this one because let's just say that you're having a conversation with somebody that tends to be very forceful in their opinion, right? So usually people might say, if you're kind of educated in cultural sensitivities, you might say like, oh, that's interesting. But what if you don't really think that is interesting? So that statement, that's interesting, is kind of a safe way to prevent, somebody's feelings from getting hurt or from coming off a little too harsh when you don't quite agree with the statement. But I would argue that this one does an even better job, because at this point, let's just say somebody, I don't know, pick whatever theme you want, that tends to be controversial. So if you disagree with that individual's point of view, then making a statement like, well, I don't agree with you, immediately closes off the conversation. So that might not also be the best way to put it. But saying, well, that's interesting, I think it's a safe way to put it, but that's one way to put it is probably more accurate, because at that point, you're really leaving that in the air. You're essentially telling that person, that's your opinion, but it's not mine. And you don't even have to disclose your opinion. I think it's a brilliant phrase. Don't beat a dead horse. That's one of my favorite American idioms. I have a whole book. I don't even know where I left it. I'll bring it in my next video, but I have an entire book on American idioms. And, like, she drives me up the wall, or, the cat's out of the bag, or, there's so many, you're preaching to the choir, any number of statements. But don't beat a dead horse is a great idiom to use when a topic has been hashed over again and again and again, and you're not getting anywhere. I think most people listening to my video would probably know what this statement is about, but it's really good because idioms tend to do an incredible job of being succinct. Ironically, of kind of activating some of the attributes that tend to live in the direct form of communication while remaining in this ambiguous space. And then lastly, let's let the dust settle. So it's a way of conveying a sense of calmness, like, let's not make any rash decisions. Let's hold off. So any one of those statements, even those very statements themselves, tend to operate a bit more in this indirect, ambiguous category. One thing to note is there is no direct, like black and white. There are some statements that could be perceived as either direct or indirect, even depending on the inflection. So for instance, if I were to say, are you going to eat that last cookie? That's a very direct form of communication. There's unambiguous, it's unambiguous. But if I were to say, are you going to eat that last cookie? I'm clearly like just packed with judgment in my words. And at that point, it became an indirect form of communication. The very same words can be used in one school of thought or the other, depending on my inflection, the pronunciation of the words, but most importantly, the intonation, how I flex the words, right? So you can imagine just any number of examples that could fit. So that's actually a really good segue into this next point, because as we've discussed, there is all of this, by the way, stems from culture, right? So let's think about language. The English language, just the language itself, lends itself to direct communication. So anything that I say in the English language is going to have a very direct, or more often than not anyways, will have a very direct inclination. Now, this is not always the case, as we just saw several examples that are indirect that stem from the English language as well. But more often than not, the language itself will lend itself to directness. What about Portuguese or Spanish? So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So if I were to say, would you like coffee or tea? And I haven't really practiced this too much, by the way. So if I were to say this in Spanish, I would say, ¿Quieres café o quieres té? And that's just kind of, even if you don't understand the words, kind of like look at my body language and the way I announce the words. ¿Quieres café o quieres té? When Portuguese, it would be você quer té ou café? And in either of those cases, there's kind of like a little waviness to the words. Now, in German, this would be etwas zu trinken, Kaffee oder Tee. So the language itself is a lot more harsh, or it's harsher. Or even in English, do you want coffee or tea? It's very direct. So German, English, these Germanic languages tend to be more direct. Whereas, Italian, tutti, 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 like Italian is very indirect. French tends to be indirect, s'il vous plaît, monsieur, madame, like very almost sing-songy, and that's just the way the language is. So depending on where you were born or where you were raised or your environment that you're in, you will naturally lean either in a very indirect way or a very direct way in the way that you communicate. So, just kind of keep that in mind, because as you interact with fellow professionals from other parts of the world, this is just very natural to them. So even in direct professional settings, you're going to want to understand how your communication is coming across, either in a direct or an indirect manner, depending on who you're talking to and how you're being perceived in the workplace. Now let's look at an icebreaker example. So with an icebreaker, just think about somebody that you met for the very first time. You have really no idea who they are, their background, and you have time. So let's just say that you meet somebody for coffee and you're having a conversation with them. So what would be the best way to engage with somebody that you met with the very first time? Would you use a direct form of communication, or would you be more indirect? Well, I would argue that if you're meeting somebody for the first time, let's say over coffee or a lunch, then an indirect form of communication is probably going to be much more appropriate. Now, conversely, let's just use the example of a morning greeting. So let's just say that you're in the office, you just got in, you grabbed a cup of coffee, and you've got a meeting coming up in about 5 minutes, and then somebody shows up at your desk and says, hey, I just want to talk for a couple minutes. And then, what might happen then is you're probably thinking to yourself, well, this person just showed up, I want to meet them, I want to know who they are, but it's very important for you to understand the context under which you're working in. And in that moment, having a very indirect form of communication where it lends itself to blending of time may not be the most appropriate way to go. So in that case, even if they are somebody that you just met, you can obviously remain very courteous and professional and say, hey, it's great to meet you. I have a meeting in 5 minutes that I'm preparing for. What do you say you and I get together around noon? Are you free then? So even the way I just described that What do you say we meet around noon? I have a meeting in 5 minutes. What do you think? So these are all very direct forms of communication that still remain, very cordial. But that might not be the best time to ask that person about their life or their relationships or, their family, or to say, oh, how are you liking the job, so far? That's just a super open-ended question that will very likely reveal any number of information that you may not be prepared to receive at that time. So in introductions, I'll probably close with this. I was actually in a meeting not too long ago, and we were doing an icebreaker of sorts, and we did have a little bit of time. But one of the questions that was asked was, what is one of your favorite places that you've traveled to, and one of your least favorite places? And though this was a group of around maybe 15 or 20 people, and as you might imagine, as the room kind of went around, people were mentioning, favorite places, Saint-Tropez or Paris, or, somewhere in Asia or Singapore, as you might imagine, just like typical, great places to go, frankly. And then as far as like your worst experience, they all had to do with like a huge layover, nothing extremely memorable. So when indirect communication comes in, by the way, this is one of those great opportunities where you can kind of go off script. In my case, I've traveled to 30 different countries, but I mentioned that my both favorite and least favorite places that I ever traveled to was Fargo, North Dakota. Now, that's because on the one hand, Fargo is kind of flat, there's not much going on. Not that I live in anywhere significantly better, but it's not probably the most, iconic place to visit in the world. But the people and even the culture were quite fascinating. I learned a lot about the Scandinavian culture that permeates much of North and South Dakota, as well as like lefse, which is a kind of like a burrito-sized tortilla that was very common because of my own background being Hispanic. And these are things I would have never learned had I not taken the time to do that. Now, if I were in Paris and I'd been there before, then you're kind of just captivated by all the different sights and sounds. But in a place like Fargo, you really tend to be, if you're anything like me, you would dive into the culture of the people, because there's not a lot of sightseeing to be had, unless you like snow and ice. But that aside, I actually used that example, and it was met with a lot of warmth, I would say. Whereas, and I'm not trying to compare myself, but what I do in these examples, I really try to lean into these things that I teach myself, because on the one hand, it's a great way for me to even test this in a real life scenario, but it's also an opportunity to see how other people react. And exactly the way I expected, people gravitated to that, because it's also unexpected. On the one hand, if you say, what's one of the best places you've traveled to? Fargo. But not necessarily for the location, but for the people and the culture and the things that I learned. And, I remember going out to dinner a few times and spending a couple hours at dinner with some amazing colleagues and just great people that work in that area, not to mention just learning. And then at one point, even volunteering for sandbagging, which isn't what it sounds like. It actually is filling bags of sand during the rainy season so that the water doesn't flood the city, because it is basically like pouring a glass of water on a table. That's how flat Fargo is. So now you know. So these are just a few examples of how you can use direct and indirect communication in your own setting. If I leave you with just one last comment, identify this in yourself. Ask people who know you, how do I tend to, or even just make an inventory of it as you go about your day. Figure out the questions that you ask and how you ask them. And you tend to lead more indirect, or do you tend to lead more direct? And then identify throughout the course of the day, what is your objective? If your objective is to get to know somebody, for instance, let's just say that you have an hour, at any given time to meet somebody, and somebody says, hey, how are you? How was your weekend? A terrible response would be to say, great, how was yours? You just closed the conversation. So maybe if somebody says, hey, how was your weekend? Pause, breathe, and then respond with, let me think about that. I did quite a few things over the weekend, but I did do something that was quite memorable. And then you just kind of allow yourself to enter into this space of indirect communication, which the other person, and by doing that, the other person will do the same. Now, of course, if you kind of read panic in their eyes, then, it's more like that British expression of how do you do? Well, you're not really expected to. This is something I've been learning from William, a guy that I follow on Instagram, super funny guy, British guy. He says, like, if somebody says, how do you do? You don't actually say, oh, I'm doing fine. It's just, you just reply with, how do you do? So at any rate, you kind of have to lean into that as well, because if the other individual was only asking that out of politeness, then that's probably not the best time to go through a full explanation of your weekend, even though you have the time. All right, guys, I hope this helped, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.